criminal justice system is a biased system. And in fact, it's a broken system. And given the fact that we have for years and years incarcerated individuals in this nation at a higher rate than any other civilized nation, and the fact that the overrepresentation of individuals of color in our criminal justice system holds no truth to the number of people who are actually committing crimes in this nation, indicates that it is in fact broken and needs repair. Imagine, if you will, the technology in the age of policing. We look at a big map and we say, okay, where is the crime occurring in our city or in our nation or in our state? And we identify certain areas and we say, okay, that's obviously where we are going to put more police officers. And this has been called many different things: intelligence-led policing, police on dots. I mean, there's all kinds of fancy acronyms for it. But in essence, we are putting police officers at a higher rate in certain neighborhoods because of what is perceived as criminal activity. As our officers go and engage the community, I don't care what community it is, and Patricia mentioned that she actually did a little comment in one of her classes that she said, all right, if we brought police dogs in here and everyone sniffed everyone in here, how many of you would end up going to jail this evening? Well, I will argue that the same activity, the same criminal activity, especially when we talk about possession of drugs, domestic violence, alcohol abuse, drug use and abuse, that exists and is in fact borne out as true in all communities, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of socioeconomic class or status or whatever other category you want to throw out there. That problem is widespread. Why then do we as police officers in the United States encounter and incarcerate people of color, and specifically people who find themselves in poverty, at a higher rate than anywhere else? And I will in fact say it's because we respond as to what the perception of crime is, and we throw more police officers there, there's more encounters, and so naturally the progression goes, and we start introducing people into the criminal justice system unfairly. And once you are introduced into the criminal justice system, the chance of recovering from that is very small. In fact, recidivism in this nation hovers around 67%. 67% of the time when we arrest people for crimes, once they leave jail or the incarceration, the criminal justice system, they are that likely to reoffend in the exact same category of crime in most cases. That is not success. And in fact, that is not rehabilitation. That is perpetuating a problem. When we look at programs designed as alternatives to incarceration, as addressing the underlying cause of drug and alcohol abuse or addiction, mental health issues, we see recidivism drop to around 40-43%. Now, while it doesn't solve the problem, it certainly reduces the problem and the likelihood that someone is going to continue down that path. We have developed, in essence, a fatalistic system in which we introduce people into the criminal justice system and have no avenue for them to find their way out of that system. That doesn't even take into account the fact that we all have within us bias, experience that we have grown up with. Right? There's not a single person in law enforcement. In fact, law enforcement officers are simply a microcosm of society. I would love to say that I'm able to recruit police officers from this magic area where there is no bias, there is no hatred, there is no negative life experience. But in fact, I don't know that they would be good police officers either, because we are made up of our experience. And a good police officer is able to take their life experience and to set those things aside and interact without bias. If we take the example of Homeland Security, the true mistake that we have made in this nation is we have made our nation safer. And in fact, the question and the debate now is, after 15 years, all the money and the resources and energy that has gone into the fight against terrorism, we were talking about this at dinner, I equate it to the big dog in your front yard. If you buy a big German Shepherd, you put him in your front yard and you're never burglarized, is it because of the German Shepherd that resides in your yard, or is it just simply because you weren't the victim of that crime? I don't know. And I don't know that we have a good way of measuring whether or not that's successful. But as we look at it, and if you believe, and in fact I could ask several people in the audience to stand up, and I would ask you, which one, as you look around the room, would you think is a terrorist? Right, now we've all seen TV, and we could certainly identify those in the room that we would think. In fact, we could go right down the list, because we know from all our life experience, and especially that of the TV and what's portrayed on the evening news, that the people from Mexico are more than likely the cocaine dealers. Black males are more than likely crack dealers. We have the bikers that sell all the meth, or in fact, a guy who looks like a school professor is now the meth dealer. In fact, it is so pervasive, right? We all laugh at how ridiculous this is. But there is no such thing as blue meth, and blue meth is not more powerful. And in fact, when we saw blue meth hit Salt Lake City, and it sold for a much higher price, we grabbed a little of it and analyzed it. And in fact, they were just dyeing it blue because it made more money. But all we know is from TV, and so of course everyone wanted blue meth, which is the more powerful. But this idea that we know what a terrorist looks like, and if we start stopping people based on what they look like or where they might be, we miss what is the fundamental basis of law enforcement and the practice thereof. And that is observable behavior. That is what probable cause and reasonable suspicion, the standards in the Constitution and in the law, is based upon. And think for a moment, if in fact we wander down the stereotypical road and we believe that someone who looks the part, right? So for a terrorist, it's a Muslim male between the age of 18 and 30, turban, beard, I mean, we can get very stereotypical. Would they dress the part, in fact, if they were intent on committing crime? And wouldn't we, if we believe that those people were the ones responsible for this horrible act or the potential horrible act, who better than to give us information than those people who worship, live, and play with them? But when we paint with a very broad brush, and we say that anyone who falls into this category is subject to our suspicion, is certainly a danger to society, we in fact alienate those very people that might give us information if in fact that were to be true. And it holds true whether you talk about immigration issues, whether you talk about homeless issues. In fact, in Salt Lake City, there's a nice little park that we classify as our open-air drug market. When you ask anyone at the University of Utah, where do you buy drugs in Salt Lake City, they all say Pioneer Park. It is not because it's a lovely park to sell drugs in with a little shade and nice lawn to sit upon, but it's in fact very close to the homeless shelter. And so we find a large number of our homeless population reside in that park and consider the neighborhood home. And the people who live in Salt Lake have grown up with the attitude that that's where the homeless hang out. They're not bothering me. I'm driving down the street. So someone can stand in amongst that group and in fact force one of them to hold their narcotics, because when the cops stop you and you're holding a big bundle, right, you lose all your drugs. So you give it to somebody who's got a little bit of an addiction problem and you say, hold this for me. And I'll give you a taste, but you steal from me, I'll take you out back and stab you. Right? And then you let someone else hold your money, and you're able to sell drugs and have people come and go where nobody interferes with your activity. In fact, because when we look at the homeless population in Salt Lake City, these are the individuals that businesses are calling on all the time. Oh, they're panhandling in front of my business. They're drunk. They're disorderly. Long list of encounters with the police that are not positive encounters. In fact, most of the time when the police are called, it's the heavy hammer that, what have you got to do with somebody? You've got to get them out of the way because the neighbors are calling and complaining, or the businesses are, so you end up taking them to jail for the evening. Jail holds them for about 2 hours, releases them back out on the street because they're not a danger. They walk away with a warrant, and they develop, and the system, again, perpetuates this fatalistic, non-productive environment. So we end up victimizing people unnecessarily. So how then do we address this problem? Because it's not enough to stand up and complain. It is not enough to stand up and say that the police are brutal and we need to change their behavior. What we need to do is change what our expectation of policing is in this country. I'm amazed how many people in this nation are willing to sacrifice their very own personal rights if we can get someone else. And that's driven by fear. Each and every day in this nation, about 450 people lose their lives to violence. Every single day, 450 people lose their life to violence. Where is the public outcry concerning that? I will not minimize any of the mass shootings that we've had in this country over the last few years. But there is a difference when it occurs in a mall in Salt Lake City or a school. Because we start to think, hey, wait a minute, I shop at that mall. My kids go to a school very similar to that. This could happen to my family. Right? Imagine all the terrorist acts that have occurred throughout the world. Well, certainly America changed on 9/11. It could happen to us. So as the fear mounts, we start to sacrifice a few of our rights. In fact, one of the most scary times I had as a police chief was when we had a young man walk into one of our malls and he shot 5 individuals. He was a young man from Bosnia who was Muslim, not practicing his faith, had no connection whatsoever to any sort of radical group, played no video games of violence, was not known for any antisocial behavior, but somehow he took this as an outlet. And there was no question in my mind, had I said that very evening that I'm going to round up everyone from Bosnia, contain them and to ask them questions, that a good portion of our community would have applauded me. That is not how we police America. In fact, there is a better way to do business. We need to recognize each and every individual in our community. The mistake that we make time and time again is it is not us against crime. It is all of us working to solve the disorder that exists in society today. When we allow police officers and our communities to look at one another like either the invading force or the unruly mob, when our first response to a gathering of individuals who want to express their rights or dissatisfaction with the government is helmets and riot gear, we say, please throw rocks and bottles at us. And then it quickly spins out of control. We need in this nation to change the debate to what is our expectation of policing. We need statistical information as to the number of times that officers use force, as to the race and ethnicity of those individuals that they encounter, to each and every person that they ask, can I search you tonight? To every home that they enter and ask, do you mind if I look in the bedroom? And then what is the result from that? We have for far too long viewed search and seizure, arrest, police interdiction, simply from how many people do we have in our community of this particular color, And if we stop them or write them tickets outright, then we're good. Well, bias and racism is very subtle. In fact, it can be interjected as something as simple as license plate violations. We need to be more in tune with the communities that we serve. I hold officers to an extremely high standard. That cannot, however, be an impossible standard. As we look at use of force encounters, a good portion of those come from this unknown suspicious circumstance. Sometimes that the neighbors call in, sometimes that the police generate. What, again, is our expectation when we call the police or when we participate with them? And until we in law enforcement develop a relationship with all communities that we serve, one of trust, one of transparency, we will be destined to repeat this. In fact, as you look at the question, how do we then stop this cycle that we have? Well, it is time that we all be very brave and say that putting people behind bars does not solve society's problems. That in fact, we should look more optimistically as to how we can help and assist people. If only from a purely economic standpoint, 3 years ago in Salt Lake City, 25 individuals cost the city $1 million in a single year for police service. That doesn't take into account the number of times the paramedics were called, the number of nights they spent in the jail, the number of times they went to the emergency room. Imagine what kind of housing and drug and alcohol treatment and mental health treatment those 25 individuals could have received for $1 million. We can do better. But it takes moving the dialogue from angry and defensive to productive and working together. Discussions like this are exactly where we start. So thank you very much.